Bindon, and I'm part of the First United Methodist Church Diversity Committee, and one of the things that we've done, for some of you who may not be aware, for the past few years we've been doing a lot of issues around race and diversity, and this is one of the series. And so what we have in tonight is a treat for you, because it's kind of one of those different approaches where we're going to have a panel discussion, and then afterwards we're going to throw it out to the audience to kind of have some feedback and reactions and conversation on the topic at hand. Before we get started, I want to start off with a reading. Before I get into the reading, just give you a little backdrop. One of the things that we have seen in this community is a divided community. We've seen people talk about Omaha as a segregated community, and oftentimes many of us have stories to tell about real estate agents steering you in different directions. Some of our local universities have said things to different folks, students and folks, about where you should live at and so on. And what's unique about Omaha is that we have pockets of everything in the city, and too often we oftentimes don't challenge it. Years ago, I remember as a newly person in an agency, I made a comment about some housing developments. And someone pushed back at me and says, people don't decide where they want to live at in terms of they have to sometimes go where they can afford. And so we need to be very careful about stigmatizing neighborhoods and groups and communities. And again, this conversation tonight is about that. So I think hopefully we can get a chance to talk more about that, have a sense of an open dialogue, as much as have panel members share some of their expertise to a number of questions we will pose to them. And hopefully we will get a chance as we walk out with a greater awareness about our divided community, or our segregated community, as some people talk about in this area. So my reading is from a different little book. It's the same genre where I go. It's Faith in the Valley, and Lessons for Women on the Journey to Peace. But I picked out one today that I think is appropriate for our conversation. Courage not only means being able to do something new, it also means taking steps to be someone new. Some of us talk a great deal because we're afraid we won't be heard. Others never say anything in fear of saying the wrong thing. Some of us are overactive and hyperactive because we fear missing out. There are those of us who are withdrawn, lethargic, inactive, in fear of messing up. One of the first things in developing a courageous outlook and approach to life is being able to look at ourselves, our beliefs, our attitudes, and patterns. Courage encourages us to examine. Examination encourages us to choose. Courage is more than forceful, aggressive, bold outward action. At its most infinite level, courage is an in-depth, inward examination which leads to alteration and application of a new way to be. And the last line goes, courage creates a new state of beginning. So tonight what we've done is we have a series of questions that we're posed to the panel members, and again, one of the things that we encourage them, I will introduce them just briefly, and then ask each one of them to introduce themselves. We'll ask them to respond to a series of questions, and again, one of the things I like to do, and some of you who do know I'm the moderator, so I will try to keep us on time, to respond to these questions. And again, some of you may have questions, observations, reactions, but I ask you to hold that until the panel members have a chance to articulate many of the issues related to these questions we posed to them. And then hopefully we will come from this event tonight with a greater awareness or enlightenment about Omaha as that segregated community. But first let me introduce briefly Preston Love Jr., and I've known him for many years. He's a native Omahan, and so I've been around for many years, and I've seen him do a lot of things in our community, as well as being involved in the Democratic Party, as well as social justice issues. So Preston will share a little bit more about him. We also asked him to bring a little bit of the history in this community because he's one of the elders in our community. The second person I'll introduce is Brandon Mass, who's also I know from First United Methodist Church. Some of you may not be aware of it. For a number of weeks, I participated in First United Methodist Church, what we call a deep dive, where we talked about race issues in between church service. And Brandon was very much involved in that and very forceful, and talked about issues from his environment, looking at life from a white perspective, but also as someone who was able to discern some of the race issues in our community, and was very much appropriate in terms of sharing some different points of view that got us thinking. So I'm really glad that he's here tonight. The third person is Nick Boyer. Sorry about that, Nick. And I always call him Nick. I'm just figuring. And he's been doing a lot of filming in the community. He's been covering almost a lot of events for the past 3 to 4 years that I'm aware of in our community. and helping us to understand issues from not only a young perspective, as a white male perspective, but also somebody who grew up in West Omaha, North Omaha in terms of experience in dealing with issues of race. So we're really excited that he can be able to share that. But also one of the things that Nick is going to be able to do for us, I think, is tie some of this together later on as he starts to work more in helping us to document some of these issues we've done at the church. And then the next person is Audrey Edmonds, who is also a young person who's graduated from Creighton University and very much give a different perspective of what it was like for her to go to Creighton as well as her living in this community. And me and her had a chance to talk a few weeks ago about some of the things that she sees in Omaha as an African-American female and some of the things that she thinks we should be about. And then the last person is Dr. Cynthia Robinson, who I've been known for a number of years, the chair of the Black Studies Department. And from time to time, I come in the department and let me teach here and there. But you know, one of the things that Black Studies is about pushing the envelope and helping many students understand about the historical Black experience, and particularly the link between Africans on the continent and Africans in the United States, and again, helping to deconstruct many of these fallacies and myths in our community. So we're really excited each one of these people or individuals can be here tonight. So I didn't give much of an introduction. I'd like to have them start and introduce themselves with more they'd like to share with the audience, and then we'll start with the questions.
Thank you very much. My name is Preston Love Jr. I'm a professor here at the university. I teach in the Black Studies Department. I also teach a course that is cross-listed in political science. I am an author. I have 4 books, 2 of which are children's books. I run an organization called Black Votes Matter Institute of Community Engagement. And my main initiative is a youth initiative where we take 40 or 50 high school kids every year on a civil rights history tour to Memphis and Jackson and Birmingham and Tuskegee and Selma and Montgomery and Atlanta, all expenses paid, with the idea that our youth, our future, they don't know it now, but they need to learn their history, respect their history before we go to try to make them make history.
My name is Brandon Mass. I teach art in after-school programs for a nonprofit, and we focus on schools in North and South Omaha. And when I started, I realized right away that I needed to fill in the gaps of my knowledge. And so I set out on a personal mission to educate myself about Black history. I got a history degree from UNO, but I liked the Bronze Age Near East, so I knew nothing about America. And I started with somebody I'd heard of before, Frederick Douglass, and I started with his own writings, so I understand the value of primary sources and how dubious other people's interpretations can sometimes be. So that led me on a path. I discovered slave narratives and moved on eventually to this new generation we have now of African American PhDs who have graduated from Black Studies departments, and that scholarship has been really impressive to me, and I feel like I've learned a lot. I have some context now for understanding the things I encounter, but I'm not an expert like my friends on the panel here, so I can give you my impression based on my experiences and what little I've learned.
My name is Nick Boyer. I'm an Omaha native, UNO grad, and documentary filmmaker. And like Ajmal mentioned, I've been documenting a lot of events and moments in the city the last 3 to 4 years, specifically looking through the lens of race and race relations as they pertain to Omaha. And this event really resonates with me because segregation is really one of the first things that comes to mind when you think about race specific to Omaha. So I grew up in West Omaha, and I think I'm on this panel sort of to represent that portion of the city, which is often branded as the white suburban part of the city, which is historically true, and I think still pretty true to this day, although the city is changing. I basically had a childhood where I didn't grow up with very many people that didn't look like me, or people that didn't have the same faith as me. It wasn't until I came to UNO that I realized not only how problematic that was, but also the perceptions that I then carried in my daily life, that I was very worried that people who hadn't kind of awakened from that weren't changing. So that's kind of what motivated me to start this project, and I've learned a lot along the way. And yeah, excited to kind of share my perspective on what I've learned filming the last 3 to 4 years and sort of where I think Omaha needs to go with this conversation.
Hello, everybody.
Testing.
Hello. My name is Audrey, and I am a transplant here in Omaha, originally from Denver. And I've lived here for over 10 years. Went to high school here. Graduated from Creighton here as well. Was raised in West Omaha, and had an interesting experience having privilege and being a person of color and having that interact together, I suppose. Graduated with a degree in Justice and Peace Studies, studied abroad in Morocco, studied Arabic, and so I have a little bit of an international perspective as well. When you put all those things together, I guess you get an interesting perspective on how Omahans are trying to market themselves as a major city, but we still have some very small town thought processes and social norms.
Hello, Cynthia Robinson. I'm a native Omahalan, a UNO alum, Black Studies major, and now chair of the Department of Black Studies. When I was about 22 years old, I asked myself this question: why don't white people like black people? Like, that was what put me on the path to Black Studies, because I just didn't understand. I had no knowledge of Black history, African history, anything of a sense of empowerment with Black people, nothing at all. But I did know about racism, and I did know about discrimination because I grew up at segregated 24th and Hamilton. And I went to Kellum School, and I grew up in Logan Platinum Projects and in that community. When I was 12, you got bused to Bryan Middle School. And then I went to Beveridge. So that was interesting, right? So yeah, so when I was 27 years old, I came back to college. I'm a River Scholarship student, came to college, 2 majors specifically in Black Studies, double major Black Studies and Broadcast Production. I have a doctorate from UNL in communication, so I teach everything from public speaking to slavery and race relations. And so that's me. Tomorrow, we are doing something called What Omaha Do You Live In? And What UNO Do You Attend? Which is very much like this. And that is 2:30 to 4 in the Chancellor's Room tomorrow.
So folks, the questions are, and I'm going to throw it out, and again, I want to keep it as interactive as possible with the panel members so that we can get as much different points of view here, as well as to drill down on some of the questions. One of the questions, what was it like for you living or growing up in your area of the city? And again, that question is premised upon we have different cities and we have different communities. Another question we threw out is, oftentimes we hear folks say that places where people live oftentimes are determined by their income, their choice, or the social norms shared by the real estate agent. From your perspective, do we have ability in how we steer where people or forced or directed to live in the city? Another question you throw out is whether education institutions like in certain areas are neighborhoods in our city. And then another question we have is, do you have any institutional efforts to change the mentality of segregation or separation if that's our goal in housing or community diversity in Omaha? And then, if money is or was a factor, would families make specific terms of where they would live at, their choices in terms of where they live at? So we asked, is income a factor in terms of where people live at for the most part? And then oftentimes we hear people talk about these issues, but really never move beyond the conversation. So we have these as questions as a foundation, but also we know that we have panel members who may even raise some other questions among themselves. And then again, as I said earlier, we're going to throw it out to the audience. So I'd like to have maybe somebody start on one of those questions and set the ball rolling, and let's say throw out some heavy light here.
Okay, I'm setting the ball rolling. First, let me say that with the short time that I have, I surely wanted to acknowledge our past, our present, and our future. In all due respect, I surely want you to recognize Brenda Council, our past. Brenda, you accept that? I know you think of yourself as a youngster. And then we have two Terrys in the house that represent our present. We have Terry Crawford, who is a university professor in Black Studies. And we have Terry McKinney, who is running for terrible. It's close, but I'm trying to get you. But he's running for the will-be vacant seat of Ernie Chambers. So that's Mr. McKinney, in case you heard his name. And then lastly, we have a gentleman standing, Dewan Hayes, who's running for City of Omaha mayor. I guess my point is we can't get really too caught up in a lot of scholarly intellectual discussions about race without recognizing the realities that we have right now. That's my point. I grew up in North Omaha, and to answer all 5 of the questions in a sentence is, when we grew up in North Omaha, we didn't make choices. We were forced to live in North Omaha because of one reason. I surely would like to make it more fun, but we were forced to live in North Omaha because we were black, and we were redlined, and we were happier than a lark. Our community was redlined. We were discriminated against. There was bigotry in our community and discrimination. We were happy and a lark. And the reason why we were is because of several factors. I'll just touch on a couple of them. One is our generation of parents were committed so much to us that they made us happy. That's one reason. They were the victims of racism, but they were not victimized. That's one. 2 is we had all of the pluses and the nourishment of our culture. We had our own culture, and we were happy. We had our own community assets. The race-based, segregated, red-line North Omaha had everything we wanted. We had our own movie theater. We had several newspapers. We had our own taxi cab. We had our own black veterinarian. We had several of our own black doctors. We had a pharmacist who was black. We had a wonderful community with so many cultural pieces, and we were happy there. And to fast forward what happened in that red line box that ended up being fertile fuel. Plants grew and flowered like nothing you've ever seen. Out of that community came someone like Brenda Council, who was on the school board, on the city council, in the state rep, out of that racist community that was so fertile, but happiness, a flower. And out of that came athletes like Johnny Rogers, Heisman Trophy winner, Bob Gibson, Hall of Fame baseball, Bob Boozer, Hall of Fame basketball, just on and on and on. Preston Love, senior, I got you. But I'm saying to you that what was it like? It was nourishing, and out of our generation produced some great people out of segregation. And the lesson in that has two parts, and I'll relinquish the mic. One is that, they want me to relinquish the mic. It has two parts. One is, what made us great is we were unified in our culture, in our history. And the second part of that is, we made a mistake. In all due respect, we chose to break that down with integration. That was a mistake. Because as we integrated, we watered down the unity, the culture, and the history. That's not disrespectful to who we integrated with. It is just the reality. Had we stayed contained, we would have stayed glorious. And as this book says, in 24th Street Glory. That's my introduction. Now what I want to say,
Wait a minute. Can I respond?
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
So, I grew up at 24th and Hamilton, right on 24th Street. My address was 2413 Hamilton, so that's right on Hamilton Street. And then I lived with my grandmother, and my mom lived in the projects, in Logan Pine Hill Projects. I say that to say, I do agree that integration has hurt the black community. I do agree with that. I don't know that I believe that segregation was the best for the black community. I think what we did with segregation is what black people do with a lot of things. What we do with chitlins, for example. We take it and make it what we have to make it. I had a mother that couldn't wait to live out west. I had a very happy childhood, though, growing up on 24th Street. I mean, the parades, the community activities. Kellum School was the hub for so many community activities. But again, when black people could leave that community, we left. And again, using my mother as an example, she could not wait to assimilate. That, I think, is our problem. So the question becomes, do we have to live in segregation to be happy? Or can we live where we want to live and still have a community? That really is the question, I think.
I was raised by my grandmother, and my grandmother was from Mississippi. I grew up on 4309 North 156th Avenue. It was called Walnut Ridge, and I was the only black person on the block, in the schools. I was expected to succeed. I wanted to go to Howard for college, but my grandmother said, no, you're going to take your butt up to Creighton, and that was the end of that conversation. I wasn't thrilled about that, but as Dr. Robinson talked about, the assimilation key, our point is very big in my specific household. I was expected to excel, and my grandmother's vision of excellence or success was the West Omaha, was getting a good education, was what a lot of West Omaha has, I feel. You can tell a lot in the neighborhood shift when you go from West Omaha to North Omaha. The energy is different, the air quality is different, the traffic is different, but also how your physical presence is received in that environment is different. I worked for Amazon for a while, and I'm not sure if everybody's aware, but Amazon has outsourced their package delivery service to regular people. So instead of driving the packages in a prime vehicle, you actually use your own vehicle, kind of like Uber. And I was delivering a package to Bennington, and my vehicle was not looked like it was part of the neighborhood, and people were very suspicious of me just trying to complete my shift at Amazon and deliver packages. I ended up circling around this neighborhood trying to find this house. Eventually somebody came out to see if I needed some help and asked me what I was doing there. They were not happy to see me. They were very forceful and made me feel very uncomfortable to the point where I didn't feel that that was a good job for me because I was risking my life to deliver these packages to people who weren't thrilled to see me.
Hello? Is this on?
Yeah.
So when I was a child growing up in the mid-1980s, I came from a family that was on the economic ascendancy. My grandparents, I had one grandparent that had 6 grades of education. But my dad had managed to pass the professional test to become an architect with just a high school education and some high school drafting. And so he was part of this architectural firm of young professionals who were all able to buy brand new houses in a new housing suburb called Heflinger or Scheckinger Park. It's at like 108th and Maple. We lived there for a few years only in our brand new house and in a neighborhood full of my dad's coworkers. And I think that what scared my parents away and what caused my family to retreat back to a small town that was 100% white people was the integration policy. So we lived there for 2 years, and in the 3rd year, I was bused to King Science School in North Omaha. And at the time, and I don't know how much of this is true or how much is myth. Making a big error.
Yeah, no, you're just talking reality.
Okay, I thought you were laughing because maybe the school didn't exist.
Oh, no. We're laughing because it doesn't exist.
I've had to reconstruct this because my parents were never honest with me about what happened. They were scared, and they insist that the reason we moved away from Omaha was because they, and this is what they say, we wanted a better life for you kids. There was also something I recall, which was that the adjacent house was purchased by a black family. And they were the only black family in this neighborhood. And I recall my father feuding with the father of that household over petty things. So they intended to have some kind of renovation or repair. And so they ordered a bunch of shingles that sat in their driveway for too long. My dad thought that it was making the whole neighborhood look bad. And he didn't like their loud music. It rattled the pictures on the walls. And there were just several incidents where the discussion was had in my house of whether they should call the cops on the neighbors or not. And when I became old enough to understand the context, I recognized that as a racist response. And I've tried to have conversations about it, and I feel like there isn't enough self-knowledge for the people in my family to be honest with themselves and one another. It's still in the point of racist behavior, but denialist speech. And so I grew up then in a small town in western Iowa that I hated. I wanted to live in a city with more opportunities for me. So as soon as I could, I moved back to Omaha and went to college at UNO. And I was curious about Omaha's diversity and the segregation. And eventually I got a job working in North Omaha. So I've tried to, I think, take the mistakes that my family made and begin to rectify them.
Yeah, so kind of speaking on behalf of a white kid that grew up in West Omaha, you know, it was almost like racism in the present didn't exist. The only time you would hear about race or racism was in history classes, you know, or talking about civil rights era, or talking about slavery. And I think so much of that is because of the majority of the base of people are white in West Omaha, or at least they were when I was a kid. Like I went to a private grade school, and there was one African American in my grade. There was probably 4 or 5 at the whole school. And even when I went to high school, I went to Miller Public Schools. The school size got bigger, but the proportions, you know, stayed similar as far as representation went. So I don't think I really had a black friend until I went to UNO, and I really don't know if I even really had an opportunity to have diverse friends until I got to UNO. I think one of the best examples I can sort of give to show sort of the cloud of delusion, I guess you could say, racially that I grew up in is with respect to how I perceived Omaha Central. I think everyone here knows Omaha Central is a pretty good school. It's a historic school. It's got great academics, great athletics. It's kind of an institution here. And as a West Omaha kid, I only knew them as having a black basketball team. That's all I knew Omaha Central for. And all I really knew about black people in Omaha as a kid was what I'd seen on the news. And I think a lot of people know kind of what that speaks for, right? What the news covers. It covers violence, it covers crime, it covers gang. And so as this kid who's had very little exposure to people who don't look like me or who aren't like me, and then that's what I see from the news, and I see Omaha Central kind of come to Miller North to play basketball, I automatically have the assumption that that is a inner city, poorly performing school, or an impoverished school. I had that racist assumption simply because of that environment I grew up in, where I just simply didn't have the exposure to break that stereotype or to break that myth. And you know, I think that culture, you know, in West Omaha, where sort of race doesn't exist or racism doesn't exist, I think whether people like to admit it or not is somewhat of a subconscious decision, because it's all about comfort for white people. You know, it's about if everyone looks like me, and if I don't have to encounter anyone that might challenge the way I live or the way I choose to live my life or practice my beliefs, then I'm living in a perfect world for me. But the truth is that that doesn't represent how the world is or how the country should be. So discovering that is really what motivated me to dive into this issue, because I just don't think, you know, the issue itself is bad, but almost what I found to be worse was that no one talked about it where I came from, you know. I think most cities in America have segregation, but I was starting to see that at least these other cities were having conversations about it. Up to the point where I came to UNO, people still weren't having conversations about it. And yet, you know, the city of Omaha branding was "We don't coast," right? It's this very prideful, very sort of boastful statement about the way Omahans are, right? You see murals that say "One Omaha." Well, that just wasn't true. That is not true. And so, based on sort of that experience is what kind of led me, I think, to seeing the problematic nature of the environment that I grew up in, which, you know, I think the national culture has changed a lot, which I think is helping, social media is helping, but we still have a very long ways to go as far as kind of getting people out west, more exposure to people who just don't look like them, don't live like them, and who aren't like them.
What I'd like to do is I want to get the panels because we only have so much time up front here, about 2 more minutes, but I want to make 3 quick comments that I think relates to this conversation. One is I had a chance, I don't always mention the college where I get to speak at, but I got invited about a week ago to speak at the College of St. Mary's. That slipped out. And I asked a student in this group, can they define the difference between prejudice, racism, and bias? And for the most part, they could not. And I asked them about the concept of white fragility and white privilege. And they basically says, we don't know a lot about that except what we read in the popular media. Now, how do you go to the university or the college and you don't understand basic terminology? But I found out they're not unique. Even in the workplace, it's the same thing. So I think we have to, again, have to deal with some of the language of even to have the discourse, but also to create these environments. Preston alluded to the issue, we were all happy in the community. Well, I respect him and I love him dearly. But some of you may know my mother's one who had to push the busing case because oftentimes I discovered, even as a kid, when I went to, back then it was Horace Mann. And when I paid my way to go to Lewis and Clark, and even my colleague who was with me was really good in math, he got to Central, he got to Lewis and Clark, he found out he was a C student instead of an A student at Horace Mann. So when you have segregated schools that is controlled by a plantation system, and we don't have opportunities, and sometimes you don't know what you don't know. Again, that's part of the conversation. But I also agree with Preston that there's something about us having unity, but do we have to have unity just by living in close proximity of each other? And those are the questions we got to raise each other. And again, it's part of this conversation. The other thing I want to say, and I think it's probably the most important for me that I've experienced in recent years, when we did All Table Talk. And I saw people across the city having dinner at other people's house across the city in places they've never been. And I've heard many wonderful, powerful stories about people when they went to another part of town and went to a different race of a house or whatever, including African Americans, went to white houses, Hispanic, Asians, you name it. And once you get into people's house, they show you love. When you eat breaking bread with folks in their house at their table, for the most part, it's a positive experience. But some of the stories were mind-boggling where someone says, I didn't know that they had houses like this. And I didn't know they had good silverware. And look what part of town, there's some nice houses here. I mean, there were stories that people didn't have a clue that in a city that is 33% people of color, we didn't know about each other here in this city. So again, part of that challenge is up on us as educators and so on. The last point, and I think is probably the most important one, I did one table talk with some school people. I'm not going to mention the school, their initials are OPS, but that slipped out. And we sat in a room, and it was probably one of the most earth-shattering, and one of my favorite terms, you guys don't know, I say butt-naked honest. That's one of those terms I use. But basically, people share some powerful stories about they knew the best schools, the best teachers, and so on. And even the teachers and administrators who were in the room said the same thing. So if they could confess that, and again, they asked us not to say their names, what does that say about us as a community when we shuffle our kids around to different schools because we know they're going to get the better education? And at the end of the day, when there are certain community members who are never invited into schools, it brings some of these conversations to the forefront. What is it like? And at the end of the day, folks, we have to do more of this. So I'm going to stop there and I'm going to throw this over to Dr. Robinson because I know she's going to say something.
Because she told you, Mike. There are 2 words that we don't really like to utter. First of all, the 4-letter word is what? Race. Well, race is really white supremacy. My research area is race. I created courses on race. I wrote my dissertation about race. I'm working on a presentation about race right now. We don't talk about race. And what Brandon talked about and what Nick talked about is really white supremacy. So what really happens and is kind of what Mr. Love is saying, we were happy because we had our own community and all of that, but it's still think about white supremacy put us there. White supremacy, did you guys know black people used to live south before we were put north? And when they get ready, now north, my neighborhood is gone, gentrified, now we out west or here or here or here. That's white supremacy. White supremacy says white people get to live where they want to live. One of the saddest things for me is to see where Hilltop projects and Pleasant View projects. Was it Pleasant View? Right. And Hilltop, which is all the way gentrified. And you got what's the area called? What's it called? Highlander. And
Fountain.
Yeah, but Local 5 is right there, but on 30th, was problematic, I was on the Will Brown Committee and went to a lot of meetings at Highlander. Highlander space by Creighton. Okay? So here we got Creighton University. I grew up within spitting distance of Creighton. You wasn't allowed to go to Creighton. In fact, Creighton students were told don't cross Cumming Street. Okay?
We're mentioning names now, aren't we?
Yes. Yes. And the thing about it is, so now I'm in this space in Highlander talking about Will Brown and racism with Creighton, which owns this space now, that people who lived in this space wouldn't be able to attend, wouldn't be able to go. That is white supremacy. We don't talk about white people get to decide this and that, which determines people's lives. So let's just look at, I don't mean individual white people, I'm just talking about racism, because that's what white supremacy is. So race is the concept of whiteness, and racism are the structures, the institutions that keep that together. And so one of the things is with busing. When people decided, okay, you're going to get bused, I mean, it's just ridiculous. I lived in Tommy Rose, 34th and Lake. My children were bused to Beveridge. They were bused to, what's the school on 120th and Blondo? They were bused to that grade school out there. And it's like, I mean, why? And then those kids out there bused down to 24th Street when our community schools should be good enough for us to go to. You know, we are blinded by a lot of things because of public policy, which might say that people that look like you and people that look like me are not supposed to live in neighborhoods where white people live. Right. So that's what public policy will say, and that's what laws will say, which then will shape our everyday behaviors. That really goes back to white supremacy, and we don't talk about it like we're scared. White. You know, we're not supposed to say that. It's crazy. The country was founded on it. And if it's one thing that could destroy this nation, is white supremacy. We need to talk about that.
I see Preston say, but that's something else but something happened. I was, some of you may know Karen Narwalese, but Miss Spencer, she passed away. She used to be part of the Black Catholic group, and she lived in Southwest Omaha. Tibbs, okay. And so we were talking one day, and she lived way out, I say Southwest, I assume. And so she was going to get the mail across the street. And her white neighbor, she lived in a predominantly white neighborhood, and the white neighbor came and started getting mail at that cluster box or whatever it says to Karen, "What are you doing over there?" She made the assumption that Karen was like a domestic or something like that. And Karen's response was to her neighbor across the street, "They got me paying the mortgage." Part of the thing is, you have African, somehow I didn't get that one, but anyway, she lived in a predominantly white area, she got her mail every other day or whatever, and the white neighbor assumed that she was a maid in the house, not knowing she and her husband lived in the house. They didn't even really know her. But when she told me that story, I had to laugh because oftentimes we see people in different parts of town and we say, "Why you live there?" And one of the questions that came back at me, and like I mentioned the person name at this point, but I live on 111th and 4th Street, and somebody said to me, "Why are you living in those triple-digit addresses? You shouldn't be living there." And folks, when you fight for integration and diversity, you live where you want to live. But what I found strange was when we moved out, we lived in 48th and Bedford, moved out to 111th Street. The following year, one of my kids got bused out of Lothrop. So it was, here we are, moved out to suburban Northwest, and my kid get bused back down. And I don't have a problem with the busing because I support busing up to a point. But they really didn't talk about race when they brought those kids around. And then the last point, an older woman said to me one day, "Jamal, we should not force our children to learn what we will not learn. So we should not put it on their back." So part of this conversation today, folks, is what are we prepared to learn ourselves so we can teach our children and be honest with them about race and issues that are very important. Preston, then we're going to move it over to the other folks. We've got like maybe for this group about 10 more minutes, so I want to make sure there's some more feedback.
I'll just take a couple of them. Hey, I could focus if I had the time on some of the questions have to do kind of where we go from here, and I want to just summarize it because I don't have the time, is that we need to seek truth. We need to seek the truth. How many of you are familiar with the 1619 Project? Oh, only about 25% of you. 1619 was the year that the first boat of slaves hit this continent in Virginia. And there is a project called the 1619 Project. We could talk an hour on that. But the sense of what is the project, is the project tries to reconcile untruths about the history starting in 1619. Are you with me? And so the solution, jumping forward to coming to grips with Will Brown, who was lynched in 1919, is we gotta have some truthful kind of conversation for us really to move beyond that. And we have to have truth about the impact, ladies and gentlemen, of slavery on everything we're doing right now. Slavery and now. There's a linkage, but you can't get to the linkage if you're not willing to deal with the truth of things. And so, that's a quick, but I want to just open that up.
Sure.
So can I tie that together with what Dr. Robinson said
Sure.
about white supremacy?
Yeah, right.
What has been happening now, and you who are in Black Studies know this, but I want to say it because I think it's an exciting discovery that I made when I got into Black Studies. There is so much incredible, unbelievable, outrageous, and horrifying truth, and you don't have to look far to find it, and there are extremely competent scholars in our ethnic studies departments around the country publishing earth-shattering books one after another. And the effect is that it's making the center of American political discourse inextricably tied to white supremacy. So if you think that you can have faith in our Supreme Court, our President, our Congress, to do anything anti-racist, you haven't learned this stuff. That's all.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on white supremacy too, because I'm glad Dr. Robinson tied into that, because I think for so many white people, they simply don't understand how much everyday and mundane things are tied to their inherent white supremacy. Like with the fact that you could live on, say, like 144th and Center, you can get up, you can go to your West Omaha job, you can shop at your West Omaha grocery store, stop for gas at your West Omaha gas station and go home, and you might not see anyone who's not white your entire day. But people who live in Central Omaha, North Omaha, South Omaha, that's not the type of experience they're likely to have. And so I just think what really needs to happen for so many white people is to understand that things like white supremacy, things like racism, things like white fragility are these just inextricably institutional things that are undeniable, and that they're not always active things, but that they're very much passive things sometimes. And that's where I think a lot of the heavy lifting has to happen with people when it comes to training and understanding that to actually make a difference.
One other point I always like to say, oftentimes when we have these presentations, we talk about African Americans, but I never want us to exclude Latinos, Asians, and Native Americans, because I think so often our culture and our history are all tied together, and oftentimes we don't raise that in these conversations.